What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today we are going to take a field trip out of the tin shed and go look at another submarine. In the previous video to this, we looked at a German U-boat that was housed at a museum in Chicago, Illinois, and today we are going back to my home state, in case you're wondering, Wisconsin, in particular Manitowoc, and we're going to look at a museum that's there. So Manitowoc, Wisconsin's actually historically been a shipbuilding community, being on the Great Lakes. A lot of ships were built there and are still built in that area or in the Great Lakes region, so pretty cool stuff. So the museum we are going to be visiting is the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. It's an excellent place. I would highly recommend that you check it out. I've only been there once to shoot this video, and I really liked it. They had a ton of exhibits, and if you're into maritime history or boat models or anything to do with ships, you would like it. With that said, I'm going to put a quick disclaimer out there. We're going to be looking mainly at the welds and the welding technology on the submarine that they have here, and I'm not going to be focusing on giving a tour so much of the boat, so a lot of the pictures are going to be up close of the actual welds and the construction. If you really want to see this boat, I would highly recommend looking at it in person. There really is no substitution for that, or there are other interior shots on the internet of it, but it's best experienced in person. And we're going to be looking at this through the eyes of my experience, which is more or less welding and welding technology. That's my expertise, not so much from a historical World War II or war history perspective. So like I say in all of these videos, if you have something to add regarding the history of what we're looking at, feel free to do that. And then anyone who wants to know more history about what we're looking at, read the comments. The people can fill you in. With that said, let's get the ball rolling. To start things off, in the museum they had a pretty cool steam-powered replica. I'm not sure if it was a real engine or not, but steam engine with an exposed crankshaft, and it was hooked to an actual boat propeller to simulate more or less the running gear of a big ship. That was pretty sweet, unexpected. From this photo, it appears as though it's a real engine or was in a ship at some point, because that'd be pretty costly to like forge or cast parts that were used on this, but the welds on it were pretty clean, so kudos to whoever made it. Definitely check that out if you visit this place. I always like it when a museum does a few exhibits dealing with the people who built what they have, and this is a great example. So here's a picture of women that worked in the shipyards up here back in the past. Now, for those of you who don't know, back in the 40s when all the men were at war fighting World War II, a lot of the women that were back home ended up going to work as welders and all sorts of other trades helpers, and in the case of this photo, they were likely all ship welders. I can't imagine what the working conditions were in shipyards in the 40s, probably a lot worse than they are today, and it's no joke today. Shout out to any of you that do work or have worked in shipyards, by the way. I'd like to get my hands on one of those vintage welding hoods there with the little vents on the top. That's pretty cool. I've never seen one of those in person. Probably pretty hard to come by. I even looked on eBay to try and buy one, and they don't seem to exist. Anyways, it's kind of cool to see exhibits for welders, because guess what? Welders made all of what we're going to see today possible thanks to their hard work and sacrifice. Alright, we're well on our way to go outside and go check out the submarine that they're in possession of, and along the way I saw this torpedo sitting on the wall with a comical "please don't sit on the torpedo" sign. Kind of laughed at that. When I saw this, it reminded me of something my grandfather told me a long time ago, and that was when he was on a Navy ship in World War II, that guys used to take the fuel out of these things and process it somehow and drink it, and it was like alcohol, and I used to think it was all BS and he was just telling tall tales, and then as I got older I actually looked into that, and apparently that was a thing. Pretty wild. The welds on this sucker seemed to be pretty decent. They all appeared to be stick welded. Some of the internal components were obviously brazed, but the overall build construction wasn't bad on these things. This cutaway was super cool because it's not like you get to see inside of a torpedo every day. I didn't realize how many tubes and boxes and all sorts of soldered and brazed components were inside of these things. It was far more advanced than I would have thought. And apparently the fuel was ethanol-based, very high proof, so possibly drinkable with some processing, although I don't know that I would have done that. Alright, enough is enough. Here is a ship that we're here to see. I believe this is a picture of it during its launch after it was constructed. Pretty neat. Here is what you've been waiting for. The USS Cobia. It is a Gato class submarine from World War II. I'll put a spec sheet up right now that you can look at. Now, compared to the German U-boat that we looked at in the previous video, this is bigger. It's longer by a decent amount, by like I think 50 feet. But the overall size isn't that significantly bigger in my opinion. However, when you're actually on board this ship, it feels like a completely different entity than that German submarine. This clearly was designed with creature comforts in mind, and you'll see in some of the pictures I took that a lot more care was taken to at least give like multiple bathrooms, decent areas to eat. The overall design of it had a clearly different idea and intention for use than what the German U-boat. A bunch of the commenters in the previous video had mentioned that this class of submarine was used in a completely different environment, deeper waters and larger stretches, I guess, than the U-boats, and that's why they were more or less set up to be easier to live in and live on rather than the German boat, which was very utilitarian and very condensed down and didn't have any creature comforts whatsoever. Now this particular sub is in the water year-round, which is pretty amazing, and 2 of the engines out of the 4, I guess, still work, and it's somewhat operational. I don't know that you could, say, make it across the Great Lakes in it. Who knows about that, but at least some of the stuff still works. Now, on a side note, you can actually do an Airbnb on this thing if you want to. Now, it's extremely expensive. It's somewhere between $400 and $600 from what I remember, which I know you're probably griping that's pretty expensive. But my guess is all of that money goes to, the preservation and restoration of this as well as to the museum. Not to mention, I don't think you can do an Airbnb on a submarine too many places. So that's something I might do in the future. Who knows? Looking at the welds on the outside of the hull, they were quite interesting. Now, I kind of got into some back and forth, not real arguments, but heated discussions, we'll call it, on the previous video, where a lot of people said that flux core and wire welding didn't exist in World War II. Well, the truth is that some form of flux core wire did exist. I don't believe is dual shield, but likely self-shielded, did exist during the early part of World War II. It was known to be used on ships. Now, based on some of the welds I saw on this boat, I would have to say that some of them were flux core wire welded just by the appearance and the very long, narrow stringers. Like, I've never seen a welding rod anywhere that looks like some of the welds that are on this ship. Now, truth be told, this boat is old and it's had plenty of repairs in its life, and what's to say someone at the shipyard didn't just, MIG weld some booger welds on it? That's entirely possible. But when we look at the overall design, especially on the interior, that would have likely not been repaired, we can see a consistency across all of the welds that really suggest a lot of it was not stick welded. And I could be wrong, but we'll look at all the pictures and talk about it. Most of the welds on the outside of this submarine were, in my opinion, far rougher than what we saw on a German U-boat. And keep in mind, this boat, I believe, was built in '43, so it's slightly newer than that U-boat, but the welds are overall far rougher. There appears to be a lot of like bead overlap where like they have super straight lines and then like a bead somehow wasn't put down straight, so then they overlap one another. I see a lot of more or less repairs where it was like undercut, where they went back and then re-welded over what was probably undercut. The overall weld quality on this definitely, I would say, is a step below what I saw in a German submarine. Back to what I was saying about the heated discussion I had in a previous video. So a lot of people had the opinion that the Germans had submerged arc welding in the early 40s, and I don't believe that to be the case. And as a matter of fact, every article I've ever seen regarding that says the exact opposite, that the Germans did not have submerged arc welding available to them, and they definitely did not have flux core wire welding. Now, the Americans did have submerged arc available for them, and from what I read, they did also have flux core wire of some sort available for use for shipyards and shipbuilding. Now, based on what I saw in a lot of the exterior welds on this, it seems to me like some of them were wire welded. And what I mean by that is they have super long, very narrow stringer welds that have no indication of a start or a stop. And I know what you're thinking. Well, if you're really good at stick welding, you can make that transparent where you don't see the start or the stop. But when you look at some of the welds on this, they really aren't that good in appearance to where if someone had that kind of skill, we would see the starts and the stops and we wouldn't see like 1 foot long beads. And on that same note, I have heard of very long stick rods being used in the early 30s where they would be like 2 foot long and you would more or less weld like a deck of a ship with this monstrously long rod. So it's possible that those were used, and that would explain why we don't see many starts and stops and pretty rough looking welds on the outside. But in the same token, later in the video, there's plenty of welds that are at least, I would say, 10 to 12 inches long with no indication of a start or a stop that aren't the best looking welds. So I don't know what to think on that. So I went on board, and first thing I had to check out was the anti-aircraft gun that was on the deck. Pretty sweet. I wish they had a $50 option to pop a couple rounds out into the lake. I would definitely pay that. Here's some random hatch cover, and I took a few pictures of this because I thought it was interesting. So on the front there, where it bolts to that hatch cover, that clearly looks like flux core wire to me. I've never seen a stick weld, unless you're running real small rods, that would look that narrow, and it just looks like wire. And again, it's interesting because you look at some of the websites out there for welding history, and a lot of them say that flux core wire didn't exist till the 50s. And to a certain extent, that's true. The dual shield really didn't exist. But what you guys got to remember is that this would have been more or less a classified military secret in the early 40s, and it probably wasn't publicly available, A, what welding processes they were using, and B, the technology that was being used was probably not available to the general public. The overall exterior welds of this sub looked very similar to this, so fairly rough, fairly narrow beads. They didn't do a whole lot of weaves, and they definitely didn't do any big wide gangster weaves either. The ripples or stack of dime appearance, I believe, is due to running some form of self-shielded flux core, because that looks like modern self-shielded flux core wire. Due to how fast the molten pool solidifies, no matter how smooth and consistent you are, you tend to get ripple patterns in it. The closest welding rod that would make a weld like that would be like 6010 or 6011, and there's a lot of reasons why I don't think that they would have been using that. Some of the steel that this was constructed out of was known as HY100, or I'll call it High 100, which is a low alloy steel that's incredibly strong, and I believe it's even to this day used for pressure vessels and for submarine hulls, a pressure hull. Well, anyways, that steel is extremely high strength, and using a 60,000 psi tensile rod doesn't make sense. Like, that would produce a lot of undesirable results. However, flux core wire can be made, even probably back in the 40s, to a standard for strength, for pressure that it can withstand high enough to where it could complement that type of steel. The welds on this don't look like stick welds at all. It definitely looks like a wire process, as do quite a large number of the welds on the outside of this sub. Now, this weld isn't really rough at all. It's actually pretty decent, but a lot of the exterior welds simply weren't. And a possibility behind this is the welding fillers they were using might have had a high chromium or nickel concentration. And anytime you start putting that stuff in a welding rod, and depending on the flux that was used, be it a flux core wire or rod, the welding puddle tends to just not wet out properly. And even if you run like high amperage, high heat input, it just tends to sit more like a bead of caulk. Again, I don't know what kind of steel any of this is, and I don't know what welding alloy they had in their fillers, but that's a possibility as well. Here's the last picture before we go inside of the submarine, and it's a pretty rough weld. This was probably welded in position, because that would explain why it's so rough, and whoever did the welding probably didn't have the most skill. As always, I'm not here to make fun out of anyone. I want to encourage you guys to get out and actually use tools and learn how to weld and build some cool stuff. At the end of the day, I guess it comes down to do your best and grind the rest. The last thing I'm going to say is that the cool thing about this place and this particular submarine is you pay your admission to get into the museum. You spend probably 45 minutes to an hour looking around at a lot of cool stuff. And then you go out on a submarine yourself. You can take a guided tour, you can take an audio tour, but you're more or less left all to your own devices, and you can spend as much time as you want, which is a direct contrast to the museum that we saw, that German U-boat in a previous video, where you had a very condensed short tour and didn't have time. They allow you to look at almost everything. Of course, some things are locked out and some rooms aren't accessible, but you can literally wander around here for hours just looking at all the cool old stuff, trying to figure out how everything works. It's pretty amazing that they just let you more or less have the keys. So depending on what door you go through to get into the sub, you wind up in the torpedo room. And I gotta say, the headroom in this room, as well as the whole ship as a whole, and just the room that it had, was significantly greater than the U-boat. The U-boat was more or less like fitting you in a skid steer that just fits. And well, for me at 6'6", I hit my head on a lot of things. Like, there's just no room. This is more or less livable. Now, obviously, this room you wouldn't live in, but the sub as a whole had far more room. Now, one of the things that was kind of disappointing and not really unexpected, since this sub didn't have holes cut through it for easy access for tours like that German U-boat, seeing the inside walls of the pressure hull was very difficult, basically impossible, because there's no cutaways of it on site. To make matters worse, the pressure hull, the inside of the walls that are curved, were covered with some form of insulation. It almost looked like concrete that was painted with thick lead paint. And I'm not really sure what it was, but it concealed a vast majority of the pressure hull welds that would be visible from the inside. So I didn't get too many pictures of those. However, we can look at the quality of the welds of all the structural members inside of it, and for the most part, they look pretty good. I didn't see any big wide gangster weave welds. They were all pretty much like this. A little bit of manipulation, nice and flat, really good clean welds. This is what you would kind of want to see on something that's going to bear some level of stress. All of the pipe penetration through the main walls, they were all welded a little bit rough, but that's kind of a hard thing to weld in position. My guess is they were welded when it was upright, so pretty hard to weld that. Speaking of pipe, here's an example of the pipe welds. Someone in a previous video on a U-boat suggested gas welding, aka oxy-fuel welding, might have been used, and I think they were probably right on the U-boat. On this, that also could be gas welded. I have no idea how thick the wall is on that pipe, but if it's thinner, the last thing you'd want to do is stick weld it. So to me, that looks like oxy-fuel. TIG did exist in the early 40s, but that doesn't look like a TIG weld to me. It's too wide, and I don't think that they would have been using that process for that type of work. I can't remember where in the sub this picture was, obviously by the control room, but this bulkhead or whatever this is looks like it was sub-arc welded. That weld was probably as wide as a quarter, really long, fairly straight. That was mechanized sub-arc, I would say. Or I guess it could be some 1/4-inch rod or something. Who knows on that? One of the most unexpected things I found on this ship was the fact that they had a tiled bathroom and shower on board. They actually had multiple showers. And when you look at this, this is actually pretty decent, far better than what I would have expected, and far better than a German U-boat. Now, that German U-boat had a lot of wood finishes, which I thought was quite interesting, like the bunk beds and a lot of other stuff. Cabinetry was all wood versus here, a lot more stainless, metal, and even ceramic stuff. Now, the door openings were very crudely welded, and it didn't really match the welding quality I saw with a lot of the other exposed welds that I could see. And it's possible that, well, one, they used less skilled workers to do this. They could have used a different process. To me, a lot of the door openings look closer to stick welding. Here's some random weld that was on the ceiling that was exposed. And again, we're back to what appears to be flux core wire to me. Super narrow, long beads. Definitely in contrast to a lot of the smoother welds that I saw on what could have been like main supports for the pressure hull. The image quality on this kind of sucks. It had poor lighting here. I don't even remember where this was on the sub, but it's an interesting photo. A lot of the welds on here are a little bit different than the rest of the ship, like that vertical weld there that likely was welded in position. Maybe it wasn't. Super wide welds there. I don't think that was sub-arc. It's not wide enough. But again, this kind of, to me, looks like a wire process. It doesn't look like stick welding. Some of it definitely is rough enough that it could be stick welding by a somewhat unskilled person. But I don't know what to think on that. By every doorway were these upright hunks of steel to help support and tie in everything. Likely added a fair amount of strength considering how thick they are. I found it interesting. Some of them were torch cut and just left rough. Other ones were kind of ground down a little bit smoother. And the welds on all of these were actually pretty decent. Like there wasn't undercut. There wasn't like poor bead placement. These were welded by pretty competent people, which is in direct contrast to the doors themselves. Some of those were pretty rough, but hey, it worked. Here's a picture of a random gate valve. One thing that always amazed me being on old warships and submarines and stuff is a lot of stuff is made out of brass and stainless, and just thinking of the cost involved with the stuff like that. Here's a random picture I took because I really like the welds. Whoever welded this did a good job. It's really hard to weld around in a circle like that and have it look decent, so kudos to them. Well, the time has come that you've all been waiting for, the engine room. So the smell in here was as you would expect. It smelled like diesel and machine oil and gear oil and everything that you would love to smell all in one room. Now, I gotta be honest here, the German U-boat had a better smell to it. I mean, this was not bad at all. I would still wear it as a cologne if I could get my hands on it. But for some reason, that German diesel engine room it had that extra little pizzazz that made it. But this wasn't bad at all, and I definitely knew the smell when I walked into the room. One of the great things about this museum is you're free to spend as much time looking at this stuff as you want. Unlike on that German U-boat where you're forced through as fast as possible, no offense to that museum, here you can just go at your own leisure. So you can inspect cylinder heads, you can look at the gauges. Don't get me wrong, you probably shouldn't be screwing with it trying to start it, but I think you get what I'm saying. They even had a cylinder head out on a tray and one of the valves from it sitting there. Now, I have pretty big hands. I wear like 2 or 3 XL gloves. Look at the size of that valve. Definitely a well-oiled machine. I like the old vintage oil cans. I also like the vintage parts over there on the desk. File this in the unexpected folder. A lathe. Not really sure what they use this for other than general purpose use, but it was by the engine room, and I didn't in a million years expect to find something like this on board. On old Navy destroyers and big Navy ships, I've seen things like this, but on a submarine, it was very unexpected. Here's an example of what I was talking about earlier. The inside wall of the pressure hull has like a coating of insulation or concrete or something, and then it was painted on and it's cracking. I'm not sure if that was done after it was decommissioned, but it makes it impossible to see a lot of the welds that are on the pressure hull. Since I didn't have a cutaway of it that I could see, aka a hole through the side, I'm not really sure how it was constructed or the critical weld quality. But I think we saw enough on the construction to get a good idea of how things were welded around this ship. So the last welds we're going to look at were on the floor of the torpedo room, where you more or less end the tour at. And the bases to these rollers were stick welded on the floor, and then those rollers were bolted on. And I believe the torpedo would sit in there. They actually had some that were decommissioned in the room, but I wanted to share something a little bit different with you guys, and this kind of fit the bill for that. Well, since the weld inspection is done, I thought I would share a couple more interesting details with you guys. Here's a cool historical photo of the crew of that submarine that you just saw. Now, I'm not sure if these guys would be swapped out to other vessels or not, but at this period in time, these were the guys that operated that submarine. I always like looking at photos like this because you can see, well, for one, how much uniforms and dress changes, and it also puts real faces behind something, and it adds like a more complete history of it, I guess. That's why I like seeing photos like this. That's why I'm sharing it with you guys. Now, I know I showed a lot of pictures of welding and not really of the layout or like the mess hall, the kitchen, the bunk beds or torpedo rooms, a lot of that stuff. And that's because I want you guys to go and visit this in person and see that. I'm sure someone somewhere did an actual like onboard tour, or maybe one's available through the museum's website. Definitely check that out, link in the description. While I was there, I noticed they had a dry dock project box, and what that is they want to pull the sub out of the water and do some restoration work, paint work, and then more or less put it back in the water and make sure that it's going to last for future generations to take a look at and explore. Needless to say, that's going to cost a fortune to do. At this point, when I was at the museum, I threw 40 bucks in it and was like, that'll probably be more than the video will ever generate in ad revenue. And then come to find out, when I released the video on a German submarine, that actually did far better than that. Most of my videos only generate $5 to $20 a video. So I thought I was in the clear. Well, long story short, my previous video of this generated a ton more, and I'm going to take all the proceeds of that and donate it to the dry dock project. And here's the cool thing about that. All of you guys out there that sat through and watched some of those terrible ads that were probably on that video actually helped generate the money to contribute towards this. So thank you guys for watching that video and probably sharing it with other people, because that is what generated enough to where I could actually make a bigger donation to help these people out. So with that said, thanks for sticking around for the video. Look forward to reading your comments. And also, thanks for watching the ads so that this place could get some help. Until next time.